Hello. So in the second part of the lecture, the second video, I would like to, in the first part, we started from some of the themes that were familiar to us from earlier parts of the course, and we tried to show how we tried to establish a connection between those and establish a bridge between those and a new theme that we're introducing for these this last week of the course, basically, which is roughly moral reasoning. And we established that connection in the first part of this lecture by way of freedom, by way of the experience we have of being able to take initiative and to take responsibility for our actions and our words and our deeds. In the second part of the lecture, I would like to just walk a second, perhaps it's a more scenic route, but arrive at the same place. Basically, moving from our theories of intelligence, our theories of mind, our theories of brain, and showing how these are in fact some way already related to questions of moral reasoning. And I suppose a better way to say it is that the questions in ethics or moral philosophy, they're already in some way implicit in themes that we have been considering from the very start. One obvious example of that is in some way a person has to in order to even think critically, in some way, like, no one can force you to think critically. Like, that has to be an initiative or a wish that comes from inside of you, so to speak. And I don't mean inside of a spatial body necessarily, for the reasons that have been mentioned earlier in this discussion about mind and brain. But I mean whatever that part of us is that we can't just cut into pieces or anatomize, right? It's a sort of it can be called the mind or the soul. The wish to try to think critically about something, the wish to learn, the wish to study philosophy, the wish to the aspiration towards wisdom. None of these things just happens by itself. And so already there's something of a moral dimension to even what we think of as kind of philosophical and abstract questions. I hope that what I say in the remainder of this lecture will, if that's not clear already, I hope that it will become clear as I say a little bit more. But if we sort of think about the way we pursue scientific reasoning. This is, of course, a very complicated topic, but we've already, and then again, just in the spirit of critical thinking, what we're not trying to do even is to exhaust the topic informationally or factually. What we're trying to do is to achieve as comprehensive a view of it as we can. And so the good news is, despite that scientific reasoning is a very complicated topic, we've already approached it from many different sides. If we think of it by analogy with the elephant, we already have collected several aspects of this elephant, and so there still remain several to cover, but less than if we hadn't covered any. And so this will be a little bit of recapitulation. But in scientific reasoning, it's always a sort of interplay between observation on one side. This is what we might call data, right, or facts, or sometimes we call evidence. That's a little bit more loaded of a term, but we might call it findings. Again, that's something of a loaded term, but we should just try to establish these different distinctions. And each one of them has a different inflection or a different nuance, slightly different meaning. But once we establish enough of these pairs, I think the kind of essential or fundamental fundamental interplay between two more or less polar, or at least complementary parts will be clear. And so if we think of the difference between on one side an observation and on the other side a theory, right? We can think of an idea and then an instance of that idea, or a fact, right? Fact on one side, observation on one side, data on one side, finding on one side, evidence on one side. On the other side is theory, idea, concept, conception, worldview even. And now we see that there's a special relation between those two poles. It's as though the kind of the theoretical pole is what allows us to recognize instances of evidence of that theoretical pole. When we talk about or evidence of that theoretical pole in the other pole, which is the sort of factual pole. The reason that I said evidence is a loaded term is because it's not as though there's just evidence that you sort of pick up and kind of assemble and put in your pocket. That's a naive way of thinking. Whenever we think about evidence, we're already seeing it in the light of a certain theory. Like, there's no such thing as evidence except in respect to a theory that it can be evidence for. That might sound very abstract and complicated, and so maybe I can give an example. And I already gave several examples, and one of them that I recall from the last video was the example of gravity, of gravitation. In order to recognize two different objects that are falling, or for example, in order to recognize the movement of the planets and the dropping of an apple as the result, the consequence of the same natural law, you have to have a very robust theory of gravity, and that's what Isaac Newton provided, the theory of universal gravitation. But suddenly you are able to show the theory. Without Newton's theory, we wouldn't have been able to recognize those two things as instances of gravitation. With his theory, suddenly we can. So theory can also be thought of as an organizing idea. It's sort of a way something confronts us by sight. And these are what we might call, this is certainly the factual or the observational pole of experience. Something confronts us by sight. The theory, it's what provides insight into what is confronting us by sight. That's one way to think about this. I offered the example of gravitation as one example to see this interplay. Another example that we might think of is, to stay with the planets, we can think of the transition from imagining the geocentric cosmos. And geocentric means Earth-centered. So traditionally, it was imagined that all of the planets were circling around the Earth. And of course, we still, in our language, we have idioms that still reflect that traditional understanding. And it's certainly not an absurd understanding. Nothing could be less obvious to immediate kind of phenomenal experience. Nothing could be less obvious than that the Earth is spinning at thousands of miles per hour through cosmic space. Quite on the contrary, what we experience is that the Earth is stationary and the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. This would seem to be, so it's very clear that when we say it rises and sets, we think of that's implicitly evidence for a geocentric picture, which means that the sun is spinning around the Earth. Now, in our imaginations, we would have to kind of imagine away everything we sort of already take for granted as people living in the 21st century. And imagine placing yourself in the 15th century or early 16th century when the two theories were kind of at odds with one another. And Copernicus had just released on the revolution of heavenly spheres, this piece that kind of started initiated this sea change in the way people conceptualized, European people conceptualized the cosmos, the universe, the solar system. we should just imagine what a profound shift that is. And it's a real shift of theory, but even almost it's like a theory, like a theory to the second power, or we could even call that a paradigm. So paradigm will sort of, it's a sort of theory of theories. It's like what organizes, imagine the whole gestalt that contains many different theories that all sort of fit together in a coherent way. The Copernican revolution was revolutionary because you suddenly have to, and just imagine yourself, try to place yourself in this and go through this transition. It's really demanding because you would have to suddenly, and we can still do this today though, because it seems so clearly the case that the sun is moving. You would have to watch the sun rise in the morning, or watch the sun set in the evening, and you will have to see that as yourself spinning away from the sun, in order for your observation to square with the theory that you say you have. The reason I say quote that you say you have is because in some ways this shows us that implicitly the theories that we implicitly organize our lives with are not necessarily the same theories that we might say that we believe. Like very few people will say that they believe the sun goes around the earth. Very few people will say that today. It's quite unpopular. It's like academic suicide to say you're a geocentrist. Very few people will say that. Nevertheless, most of us, we certainly go about our day as though that were true. So I hope this example has somehow served to illuminate the relation of fact and theory, or observation and theory, on the other hand. It will also be clear that that observations are always serving to, in some ways, refine or articulate the theories we have, right? So every new observation has the possibility to subtly alter the theory that we're entertaining. If we can think about the mind and the brain, this is happening all the time now because we're on the forefront of this kind of science. But every time that a new study, a new electroencephalography test measurement is performed, a new functional magnetic resonance imagery, every time a study is performed, this has the possibility to contribute and refine certain theoretical ideas of what is the relation between brain activity and mental activity. So there's a specific relation between fact and theory. If we in the last lecture, so in the lecture about mind and brain, I compared the way that you could look at a brain, like you could have a brain before you, and you could look at it. And I said something along the lines of, you can't look at a mind in the same way. You can't look at your mind in the same way that you could look at your brain. But if we certainly you can't do it in the same way. But there is some way in which you can look at your mind. And in fact, that's partly what we mean by critical thinking. So in some ways, critical thinking is attempting to reflect upon our own upon the thing that's doing the reflecting, right? Upon our own minds. That's something that I haven't said it in those words, but it's, in some way I think it won't be surprising. It's been implicit in our way of operating through this entire course. Now, if we do look at our own minds in that way, we will find something similar to, for example, what I was describing about the fact and the theory. These are sort of findings that are the result of having sort of looked at our own minds and observing the way in which we establish scientific knowledge. I would like to, though, introduce these. They're kind of in basic logic. There are sort of two different categories of reasoning that are set forth, and despite that this is not a formal logic class, in some ways it's an informal logic class. And so I think it's important to at least introduce these ideas. There's different ways to talk about them, or different names for them. But if I offer a couple names and then describe them, I hope that it will be clear what the names are referring to, and then we can then we'll have a sort of understanding of the meaning of the names, and and that's kind of that was the definition that we came to of intelligence, of critical thinking itself. So these two ways of thinking, and then if we start with this, the dichotomy that I've already established between the sort of the theoretical or ideal pole and the factual or the observational, the pole of findings. Imagine that you have to sort of another thing we could think of is the principle and the instances of that principle, and that's maybe the easiest way to express this distinction that I'm now going to try to make. And the distinction has something to do with the process of kind of ascending and descending between those two strata of cognition. Imagine that you have something like this is actually so we could take an example that we've already used in this video, like gravitation or heliocentric model of the universe. But instead, I'm going to use a very familiar principle that has been with us since if not the first, then the second week of this course, and that is the parables of. So the parable of Plato's parable of the cave is something we read on our very first meeting together. Plato's parable of the cave, the blind man and the elephant, is something that we read on our second meeting. And so these have been kind of constant companions with us through the whole course. And the reason that they've been constant companions with us through the whole course is because we've found them very useful. We found many thousands of different, maybe thousands, I don't know, I'm not keeping track. Because if each of you has found a number of reasons yourself, a number of occasions yourself to use that to apply that same principle, then I think it could easily be thousands. But if we think about what is it that, when we talk about applying, or why is it that we find Plato's parable of the cave useful and relevant? And it's because we're somehow seeing instances of that, whatever that story represents. We're discovering instances of it in our discussions. Similar to it's similar in the case of the blind man and the elephant. It's that we find instances of whatever that parable is presenting to us. Then we discover kind of ways in which it appears. We could also think about this in just in terms of anything. It's like if I know what a table is, then I'm able to recognize all tables, even if the table is like a picnic table. And by that I mean like a blanket on the grass. In some ways I can see that as a table, even though it doesn't look anything like a 16th century dinner table or something. They're outwardly, by sight, they're totally different, but I'm able to recognize the same thing. Now, if I'm starting from the idea of a table, if I have that idea already, then it's not difficult for me to sort of moving down. And so it kind of has a downward motion, and this is just this is a kind of a picture of something that's not really spatial itself, but it's moving from a general, which is the table, to the particulars. And so if I know what a table is, then I can see all tables. Now imagine that I'm somebody who doesn't know what a table is. Or I'm someone who's never heard of the parable of the blind man and the elephant, or someone who's never read Plato's Cave. This is much more difficult. And suppose that I had to somehow come up with the idea of Plato's parable of the cave without already knowing that story. Or suppose that I had to kind of come up with the concept of table by being presented with different instances of tables. I might be able to manage this, but it's much more, it's much less certain, and it's much more tenuous, sort of. And so it kind of has a sense of trying to climb upwards, and so it's like it's moving against the gradient of gravity. It's like it takes more work in some way to climb upwards by gathering together particular instances and trying to say what is similar between all of them. We can see Socrates is often, well, he's doing both of these things, but he's asking requesting of his interlocutors that they try to do this with him, they try to make this ascent with him. And you can see how strenuous it is to think in that way, because it's somehow you don't already have the principle, and so you have to somehow arrive at the principle by way of the particulars, and it's much more difficult. Well, it's much less certain. It's less stable. And so now to go back, there's one that has a sense of kind of moving to the particulars from the universal. This has traditionally been called deductive reasoning. This is a kind of reasoning that's basically certain, because you start with a general principle, and then you move to a particular instance of that principle. The other kind has traditionally been called inductive reasoning, and so it's kind of the reverse image, or the reciprocal image of the first one, which is moving from particulars and trying to arrive at a universal conclusion. Now, I think one thing that kind of it probably won't be surprising, but you can never be certain with inductive reasoning. You can never be certain about that your principle is the right one, that it's true, because you're not starting from that point. That's where you're trying to arrive, and suppose that it's like whenever you make a generalization, all it takes is one exception to that generalization, and it's been falsified. From the other side, if you're able to start with a generalization, anything that could falsify it doesn't, because it simply doesn't fall under the umbrella of that concept in the first place. Now, this can get quite complicated and quite involved, and I don't think a video lecture like this is the proper place for it, because in order to really to really explore the intricacies of these two types of reasoning, we would have to have we have to have an ability to sort of dialogue and ask questions. But this is something that I think that what I said is enough to at least anyone who is inspired to learn more. I'm confident that what I said can give you a start, and I also think that what I said it's not something that you will just find in your own textbook on this subject, which you can easily go and find the section in the textbook for this course about deductive and inductive reasoning. I think that what I said is it's not just a repetition of what you'll find in that book. I think it gives it kind of complements anything that you'll read in that book. The last comment I'll just make about these two kinds of reasoning is that this very poetic way of talking about them, and this comes at least I know it coming from Thomas Aquinas, a philosopher from the I believe 13th century, and he called the deductive reasoning. His term for that was he was writing in Latin, but he called it morning knowledge, and so it's something in Latin like matutina cognitio. Morning knowledge, and the kind that's moving from particulars, trying to arrive at the general or the universal. He called that evening knowledge, so vespertina cognitio. And now, and those are both more or less kind of on the sort of scientific side. We haven't really crossed the bridge yet. Forgive me, but I think that the distinction now will be quite clear because we've bothered to really establish where we're starting from. If we cross the bridge, what will be necessary is to recognize the fundamental difference about that comes into play when we're talking about moral reasoning. The difference is that in some way, those instances are not there yet. We are creative of those instances. So if you imagine starting from a principle like fairness, for example, if you start from fairness, you're the one in your own speech and your own actions and your own deeds. You're the one that goes and becomes an instance of fairness in action. And this is totally different than reflecting on fairness. And so the kind of moral, in order to reason morally, it's always in some way embodied, at least embodied in the sense of you're always doing something. It always comes from your own initiative, right? And it's like you become an expression of fairness in your speech or in your deeds, or you become an expression of truth in your speech or goodness in your deeds, right? And so I think that's just such a categorical distinction between what we would call scientific reasoning, which is basically, it's kind of, I hesitate to say it this way, but in some way it's partly accurate. It's that in scientific reasoning, you're reasoning from an arm's length, so to speak. In moral reasoning, it's quite, you're actually part of the process of, like, you become the reasoning itself. You live it out in a way that we don't always with science. That being said, this I think is important to emphasize, is that now that I've established the kind of neat division, I'm going to go back to something that I said at the outset of this lecture, which is that there's really, you can't make this kind of, the kind of distinctions we make in space, where two things are separate from one another. We can't make these same kind of distinctions when we're talking about the other dimensions of life, because all of these ideas and principles are so, they are intimately interpenetrating and related to one another. I want to show what I mean. It's that any kind of scientific theory is a way to, it gives us knowledge about what kind of place the world is. And if we are going to live and act in the world, we're living and acting in the world according to what kind of place we think that world is. And so if science is giving us the answers on the first side, it's directly influencing the way we live and act in that world. And so it's really impossible to, in practice, those two kinds of reasoning, moral reasoning and scientific reasoning, we can make these distinctions to separate them, but in real life they're not separate, and in fact they're always mutually influencing one another. That's, I think we couldn't expect anything other than that. The reason being is because in principle, all of these things that we have talked about this whole semester, and today is no exception, all of these things are essentially and inextricably united because they share a common source or origin, or location, but not a spatial location. And that's us. That's each of us. And because science is part of our lives, because ethics is part of our lives, we know that they're related in principle, because they're both part of our humanity and our lives. There's much more, naturally, there's much more that could be said about any of these things, but I think that's probably more than sufficient for now for this lecture. And so on that note, I will conclude, and as always, wish each of you the best, and know that you have my best wishes during these strange days for all of us. And so on that note, farewell for today.